Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the war in Ukraine. I'm Millicent Walker. First, the headlines. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky calls for direct negotiations with Russia, says it's time to talk. Russia's Vladimir Putin accuses Ukraine of stalling peace talks with unrealistic proposals in a call with the German Chancellor. Plus, Russia says it has used its newest Kinzhal hypersonic missiles for the first time in Ukraine. It's day 24 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for negotiations and peace without delay, directly telling Moscow it is time to meet. Meanwhile, efforts to rescue hundreds of people trapped in the basement of a bombed theater in the besieged city of Mariupol are being hampered by intense battles in the area. Ukrainian officials say Russia attacked the site, which was clearly marked as a civilian shelter. Moscow denies it. Russian forces have encircled the city, which has no electricity, water or gas. Here's a summary of the situation on ground.
Now is the time for meaningful talks. That's the message from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to Moscow, as he calls on Russia to stop its invasion and for direct talks with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. He urges Russia to limit its own losses, saying it's time to restore territorial integrity and justice for Ukraine. However, Russia's Vladimir Putin accuses Ukraine of stalling peace talks with unrealistic proposals. Moscow also says the U.S. is restraining Kyiv from agreeing to Russia's demands. Since President Putin launched the assault on February the 24th, Ukrainian officials say Russian forces have taken heavy losses and their advances largely stalled. But they've also laid siege to cities, blasting urban areas to rubble. And in recent days, they've intensified missile attacks on scattered targets in western Ukraine, away from the main battlefields in the north and east of the country. The port city of Mariupol has been hit particularly hard. Officials there say fighting has reached the city center and that heavy shelling has prevented humanitarian aid from getting in and stopping rescuers from reaching hundreds of survivors trapped beneath a shelled theater. The situation in the city is desperate, with as many as 300,000 civilians unable to evacuate and are without food or electricity. Meanwhile, Russia's defense ministry says it had used hypersonic missiles for the first time to destroy a large weapons depot in Ukraine's western Ivano-Frankivsk region.
As we did in 2014.
As condemnation continues, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the West must not try to normalize relations with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
A victorious Putin will not stop in Ukraine, and the end of freedom in Ukraine will mean the extinction of any hope of freedom in Georgia and then Moldova. And it will mean the beginning of a new age of intimidation across the whole of Eastern Europe, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And if Putin succeeds in crushing Ukraine, it will be the green light for autocrats everywhere in the Middle East, in the Far East. This is a turning point for the world. And it's a moment of choice. It's a choice between freedom and oppression. And I know there are some around the world, even in some Western governments, who invoke what they call realpolitik, and who say that we're better off making accommodations with tyranny. I have to say I believe they are profoundly wrong. And that to try to re-normalize relations with Putin after this, as we did in 2014, would be to make exactly the same mistake again.
Moscow calls its actions in Ukraine a special operation to demilitarize and denazify its neighbor. The United Nations says more than 3.2 million civilians have been forced to flee the country, while 6.5 others are eternally displaced.
And that is about day 24 today. But let's take you back a few of the highlights of what happened this past week of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We begin with day 19, which was Monday. The fourth round of Russia-Ukraine conflict took place. Russia alleging, asking China for military help and aid in evading sanctions. Also on that day, 21 children were flown to the United Kingdom for cancer treatment. And we heard about the bombing of shelling of a residential building in Kyiv, where at least one person was killed and 3 others injured. Also, Ukrainian president urged NATO on Monday to impose a no-fly zone. Tuesday, day 20, Kyiv's mayor announced a 35-hour curfew for people in the capital, warning of difficult and dangerous moments. Prime ministers of Poland, Czech Republic and Slovenia traveled to Kyiv, which was seen as a symbol of support for Ukraine. And this was for talks with President Volodymyr Zelensky. And of course, Ukrainian president pleaded with European nations to send Ukraine more weapons. Wednesday, President Zelensky said peace talks were now much more realistic, even as Kyiv continued to witness massive shelling. The G7 leaders also met virtually over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. US Senate branded Russia's president a war criminal, and Russia of course, had to pay a dollar-denominated debt, which they met at the end of the day. Thursday, Russia condemned U.S. president's calling him a war criminal. The United Nations Security Council was to meet on Ukraine-Russia crisis. Iconic Ukrainian art also got a looking, even as war pummeled the country. Russia also accused of shelling a cultural center in Kharkiv. On that day as well, Ukraine's children were said to be at risk of displacement and death in the war. Friday, just yesterday, there were heavy shelling reported near Lviv airport. Australia and Japan equally imposed more sanctions on Russia. U.S. president and Chinese president held a virtual core summit over Russia on the Ukraine war. And we also heard South Africa blaming NATO for Russia's war invasion of Ukraine. Well, Russia's war on Ukraine is entering its 4th week as increasingly harsh rhetoric from Western powers towards Russian president fails to stop attacks in several cities. It is near impossible to verify how many civilians have been killed so far. But according to the United Nations, more than 800 have died, but the real figure is feared to be higher. Reports say thousands of soldiers on both sides have also died. Security analyst David Otto joins us now to discuss how the situation might develop from here, and both countries talking about their military strategy. Thank you, David, for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Although Russia has one of the largest, most powerful armed forces in the world, British defense officials say Russia's invasion has sort of stalled. But President Putin has denied this, saying it's going according to plan. What's your assessment of Russia's strategy?
I think what we've got to understand is that, first of all, Russia's strategy is top security. I mean, it's top secret. Nobody really knows what Russia wants to achieve. But what Russia has said, in comparison to what we see on the ground, is that they have made it categorically clear that Ukraine has to stay neutral. They do not want Ukraine to become a member of NATO. So the strategy for Russia is to deny Ukraine the ability or capacity to be able to somehow join NATO. And, from what we see on ground, Russia has also made it clear that they want a demilitarization of Ukraine. Therefore, they do not want Ukraine to be used perhaps by NATO or any NATO state to stockpile weapons. So that is one thing they are also asking for. But I think the other thing which, Russia is looking towards, from its, behavior during this invasion, is that they want to make sure that the likes of President Zelensky and, his followers and all those who are very close to NATO, those who have what I call the NATO nostalgia. Russia wants to see them out of power. They probably want to have a much more puppet state to be in power in Ukraine rather than what is actually happening now. Are they winning the war? It's very difficult to know and to tell because you don't know what the plan was. We don't know if indeed Russia intended to win the war or they just intended to achieve their strategic objective of making sure that Ukraine becomes very unstable to the extent that even NATO will fancy not having Ukraine as a member of its club. So so far, I think Russia is achieving that aim. But this is actually in the back of all the sanctions, as you know, that are coming in: the economic sanction, the political and diplomatic sanctions that are going on. Member states being told to stay away from Russia. So it's very challenging, but I can tell you for sure that nobody really knows what Russia wants to achieve as a matter of strategy, except the fact that Russia has made it very clear that Ukraine must not become a member of NATO, come rain, come shine.
And then, David, considering that I think Ukraine now has sort of backed down being a member of NATO, what do you think about its ability, in talking about Ukraine now, to withstand the Russian forces? This appears to have caught a lot of people by surprise, but what do you think has worked to their advantage? Is it the supply and the support of weaponry that they're getting from NATO and other countries?
There are two types of wars being fought here. One, Russia is like the giant and, Ukraine happens to be like the Lilliput here. So you cannot compare the military might of Russia with that of Ukraine. But of course we know, and, the Western and NATO allies have made it very clear, and they've backed that with action, that they will support, Ukraine indirectly. They will supply them with weapons, they would send money, and all sorts of, help to make sure that, Ukraine stays very strong. But, from a military point, Ukraine cannot win. But where I think Ukraine will be, would have the advantage is if Russia decides to occupy Ukraine, or perhaps annex Ukraine as it did in Crimea in 2014. But I'm very unsure that Russia would want to do that. Look at the experience of Russia in the 80s, with Afghanistan. They couldn't sustain that, and that is what led to the collapse. One reason that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, we saw the same situation in Afghanistan with the US. So I don't think Russia would want to repeat that mistake of actually occupying and trying to govern Ukraine. I think what they would do is, they would look for a safe face reason, and, they would pull out their troops away from Ukraine. But, if they go the insurgency way, I think Russia will not survive. But let's see how it goes. But I'm prayerful, something which, I believe more in action. I believe that, much more some level of negotiations will come in, and Russia will pull out its forces, having achieved this aim, that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO.
That's what a lot of people are hoping. But do you think that Russia still sees Ukraine as a sort of cousin or brothers? Although Russia has denied targeting civilians, it's also clear we're seeing a shift in that strategy with more targets, greater use of artillery and missile strikes. What do you think, and could this up the tempo in the days to come?
I think one biggest casualty of this war is the high level of propaganda. It's difficult to ascertain, who is telling the truth and, who is telling, tales. But what is very certain here is that, there are casualties, and Russia has been accused of targeting civilian population. That is also true because there has been evidence of that. But the extent to which that has been shown to be accurate is something that one must be able to take with a pinch of salt. But even if one civilian was targeted, that should be condemned. One thing which is very clear is that the invasion of Ukraine is wrong. Now, the justification is something that, one cannot actually buy, from what Russia is saying. But, what I think, we should be looking at here is how do we really get to a point where there is, some kind of an intermediary to come to the rescue of this crisis? Because, of course, Ukraine is not going to back down easily. They are being supported highly by the United States. But the disadvantage here is that this is not Ukraine's war. This is a war between the United States, NATO, and Russia. Because, of course, there is no benefit for Ukraine, to join the NATO other than NATO, posing a threat to the borders of Russia. And, of course, there is also no benefit from Ukraine in abstaining from NATO other than, being threatened by Russia as the case has been. So this is a war between Russia and NATO. Ukraine is just the playing field. And I really feel very sad and sorry for, the way that this has gone for the Ukrainians. They are not the main players here, but of course they are taking the biggest brunt.
We've heard from NATO, speak about preparations for other countries, around that part of Europe. We also know President Biden will be going to Europe, meeting with NATO and other members. Do you see NATO being sucked into this conflict?
NATO is already involved indirectly. What we haven't seen is NATO troops on ground and, the planes flying in the air. They've refused. That there is no way that they would, carry out any airstrikes, against Russian troops or, help Ukraine in that manner. So there is no doubt that NATO members are involved already, but for the physical boots on ground. What we've seen in the economic sanctions, in the level of propaganda, in the level of, information or disinformation, on all sides, of course, NATO is involved already. But the fear and the concern of the world should be that we do not want to see a situation where NATO forces, are clashing with Russian forces. Because, again, what that would mean is that it would generate illegitimacy for Russia to launch an attack against the US or NATO members. And that is where Europe becomes involved. So we've got to be, very, very careful here how and I'm sure that is, President Biden of the US has made it very clear that they will not directly get involved. But of course, they are already involved in supporting Ukraine, from the background. So, they're involved. That would be my answer to that.
All right. And African countries have, faced some criticism for remaining somewhat silent in this conflict. Should African states stay neutral based on the non-alignment policy? This is also following what 17 nations refusing to take sides at the UN Security Council vote.
African nations are doing the right thing to abstain. There is no reason to support one side or the other in a war of this nature, because then it spreads beyond its expected boundaries. You've got to understand that from a diplomatic perspective, African states have a very strong relation, even during the colonial and imperial time, with the then Soviet Union and now Russia. So I don't see any reason why the United States, for example, will be expecting African nations to get involved in support of one side or the other. What we want to see is African nations, fixing their problems in their own country, but also getting involved in mediation in situations where this kind of crisis occur. Of course, when there's a crisis in Africa, we see the European states, the West, coming to get involved and say they want to mediate. This is also an opportunity for African nations to stay neutral, solidify their economy, but also get involved in mediation. That's what we want to see. We don't want to see African nations taking sides where it is not in their economic interest.
Security analyst David Otto, thank you so much for joining us on the programme this evening.
Thank you.
Mariupol is the worst hit area of Ukraine, facing almost constant shelling. Ukrainian authorities say about 90% of buildings in the city have been damaged or destroyed. The city is strategically important because taking it would enable Russia to create a land corridor between areas controlled by pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine and annexed Crimea.
This drone footage shows the utter devastation wrought by the Russian assault on the southeastern Ukrainian city of Mariupol. The port city has been encircled by Russian forces and has been the scene of some of the fiercest bombardment of the conflict after Russia sent thousands of troops into Ukraine. While fighting in the city continued this week, people evacuated through the district controlled by the forces of the self-proclaimed People's Republic of Donetsk on Thursday. A statement from the city council said that about 30,000 residents had managed to escape so far since Monday, but more than 350,000 remained. Mariupol residents have no electricity, gas, water or communications.
The country's food supply chain is falling apart. Movement of goods has slowed down due to insecurity and the reluctance of drivers to drive to places like Dnipro, let alone Mariupol or Sumy. We are especially concerned about the families in the encircled city of Mariupol, which is running out of its last reserves of food and water. Very little aid has been allowed into the city since it was encircled more than 2 weeks ago.
Mariupol Council estimates that about 80% of the city's homes have been destroyed, of which almost 30% were beyond repair.
We're living in basements. It's a horror. What for? Tell me, what for? What are we guilty of? In whose eyes are we guilty? We have nothing. Everything is destroyed.
On Wednesday, Ukrainian authorities said that Russian forces hit a theater where hundreds of civilians were taking shelter. But Russia denies bombing residential areas or targeting civilians. Ukraine says more than 2,000 people have died so far in the city that has been a key strategic target for the Russian military in its offensive. The city of more than 400,000 lies between territories held by the pro-Russian separatists in the Donbas region and Crimea, a peninsula that Russia annexed in 2014. The city is only a few dozen kilometers from Russia's land and sea borders. By seizing the city, Russian President Vladimir Putin could create a corridor between Russia, the Donbas area and Crimea, and take full control of the Sea of Azov.
And the UK Foreign Secretary is warning that Vladimir Putin may be using peace talks between Ukraine and Russia as a smokescreen for the Kremlin to regroup troops for a fresh offensive. Liz Truss says it's up to President Volodymyr Zelensky how his country approaches peace talks. She says she fears that the negotiations, which have been said to have made some progress, were a smokescreen.
When we're facing a tyrant like Vladimir Putin, the only thing he understands is strength. We need to stand up for our societies, and we must never let our guard down again. Our new trade and security deals are with our allies, not our opponents. That's why AUKUS is so important, helping our Australian friends acquire the nuclear submarines they need to defend their territory. That's why NATO is so important, and it's why we're strengthening it for a new era. The UK is the biggest European spender in NATO, and we're building up our support, our troops in Estonia and Poland. We have seen the most horrific, horrible scenes in Ukraine. We have seen a war in Europe for the first time in decades, and we're seeing incredible bravery from the Ukrainians and deeds of valour that will be written about for generations to come. Britain has stepped up. Now we must do even more. Putin must lose in Ukraine, And with Britain at the forefront, we will ensure he does. Our two nations understand how precious freedom is and what it means to fight for it. Our friends in Ukraine see and understand the strength of our support. I hear that some people in Ukraine sing God Save the Queen as they use British equipment. Well, Ambassador, everyone in the United Kingdom is saying Slava Ukraini.
And that's our abridged version of our special coverage of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker. Coming up shortly is Diaspora Network. Stay with Channels Television, your home for the news.